So the first architect we're going to talk about is Frank Gehry, and um, what order we go in with the architects, I do not know, and I consider him probably the third most famous American architect. He's the only one currently living. So before we get too far involved into Frank Gehry and some of his buildings, I want to reiterate and I want to talk a little bit about architecture and what it is. So architecture itself is inhabitable art. Okay, the buildings itself should elicit different feelings, different emotions. Okay, and so you're trying to get a different aspect within it. Okay, it is art itself. Okay, art itself reflects the culture in which it is made. Okay, so European style art is different than Western style art or Eastern style art. Okay, the Persians made a different art than the Egyptians. The Greeks made a different art than the Chinese, and so you have to remember that it reflects that. Okay, as our cultures changed. Okay, for example, I personally think of when I start to think of art and how much it changes, I start at the 1960s, okay? And how the art in the 1960s changed quite a bit because society started changing, okay? Art reflects the society in which it's made in, okay? Medieval society is way different than modern society. And because the society changes, the art and what is acceptable changes. One of the key aspects, and the easiest way for me to try to explain it and to show it, is when you really think about music and how it has transformed from the 1940s to modern day. In the 50s, when they introduced rock and roll to what music is now, or the common cultural music is now, has greatly changed. Okay? One of the key aspects is showing how the culture and the society has changed. And the easiest one in my mind is thinking about the Beatles. Okay? The Beatles' music changed. Early on, the Beatles were very much the 1950s sound. The Beatles were very much a boy band singing about love and holding hands and talking about traditional values. As they progressed in their music and the culture which they were around changed, and the society started changing, and in the 60s you go from a very traditional Korean conflict, traditional values, to where the counterculture in the late 60s was very much anti-war, like with the Vietnam era. And so their music reflected that, okay? Reflected how society changed. The Beatles had anti-war songs, okay? Just like everybody else in that time frame. And so you had different aspects and different feelings, and as they used different instruments. In the early Beatles days, they used pretty much 4 or 5 instruments. They had a guitar, they had a bass, they had a drum, and they had a piano. Okay? In some of the albums later, they started introducing sitars, they had an organ. So as we said that, and saying the architecture is art, understand that the buildings change and what we desire in the buildings change. Next, history itself gives us context, okay? And that we cannot completely leave out history within it and our reflections of what is going on. So, moving on, Frank Gehry, okay, Frank Gehry is still alive. Now, he's in his 90s. He was born on February 28th, 1929 in Toronto, Canada. Okay? And I did say that this is American. He is an American now. He has dual citizenship in both Canada and the United States. Okay? But you need to understand that Frank Gehry, that over his lifetime, he was born in the British Empire. Okay? And so that is one thing we have to understand. We're born in the British Empire and how much that has affected his life. Okay? He was born prior to World War II in the British Empire. Okay, Toronto, Canada. Canada didn't get its independence until the early 80s. So some information about his schooling. Okay, he has talked about his experiences in woodshop and that he really enjoyed his time in woodshop designing, or not necessarily designing, but building things. And so he talked about how he enjoyed building birdhouses, and that kind of led him down the road of becoming an architect. But when he graduated high school, he didn't feel like architecture was what he wanted to do, because when he was in high school architecture, he took some high school architectural drafting classes. He hated it, and I'm gonna tell you, I hate high school architectural drafting, and because I feel like it is very much about the prints and not enough about the design and the beauty that is the building. Okay, he gave a story on one of them where he was talking about how he was taught architecture by being told to draw a Cape Cod. Now, I don't know if you guys know what a Cape Cod is. I'd highly recommend you go looking it up. But it is a it is an early American architectural style that is very plain Jane that our settlers used in New England. Okay. And so there isn't a whole lot architecturally going on, especially with the facade. And so he hated it. And you probably don't know what Cape Cod is, because I hate it too. I think it's boring. I mean, it gives us context, but it's not a very good American style. Okay. So from there, he attended. So in 1947, his dad, I guess, had a heart attack when they were still living in Toronto. And he decided he did not want to live in those harsh winters anymore. So he upped and moved his family to Los Angeles. And while he was there, because he's already graduated high school, he started attending a community college. And he started taking art classes, which he always enjoyed art, always has enjoyed art. And in 1947, he was taking a ceramics class. And he started attending Los Angeles Community College, and he talked about his ceramics class and how much of a profounding effect that his ceramics instructor had on him. While he was in the class, the instructor told him, he goes, I enjoy your passion, but really you may want to consider architecture because you're not any good at ceramics. So that kind of led him down the architectural path. And from there, he went and attended University of Southern California. And in 1954, he graduated from architecture school there in at USC. So along the way, he met a famous liberal architect of the time who was really big into the modern architectural movement and art style. And with that meeting and a few conversations with this individual, it sealed the deal. He wanted to be an architect. And so he proceeds to leave there. And then in 1956, he goes to Massachusetts and attends Harvard in city planning. And he got wrapped up, and Frank Gehry has very liberal, and Frank Gehry has very radical ideas, and as you can see, and I'll get into the picture a little bit, that's some examples of possibly some radical ideas that he had. So along the way, he got tied up within a project, a secret project this guy was doing with this uber conservative Cuban dictator, and he wanted nothing to do with it. So he actually never finished his degree in city planning and returned back to Los Angeles. So this is one of Frank Gehry's works. This is his personal home. It's in Santa Monica, California. So he grew up, I guess his grandparents owned a hardware store. And so he was very, very accustomed to the items that he was able to find in his grandparents' hardware store. And so he actually, when he went and redesigned his own home, he used a lot of the same elements. And so a lot of elements in there is you have a lot of wood, and actually he uses a lot of chain link fence within the design. I like his work. I think this piece myself, I think looks like garbage. I feel like this is something that but I also have to remember it's something that was made very early on within his career, and he didn't have a lot of money. It just seems like something that somebody who doesn't have a lot of money just kind of slaps different things, different projects together, and it doesn't really mesh. But that's the start of a Frank Gehry style home. So, moving on. So some of the jobs, along the way. So when he was an undergrad there in LA, he was a truck driver. So during the day he would drive truck, and then at night he would go to class. After he graduated, he actually served a little bit of time. I think it was the Air Force. He served time in the U.S. Armed Services. From there, he returned to LA and did some work under the architect Victor Gruen and Associates. And so that was and that was during that time frame was some of the most influential times of his life. From there in 1961, I think he got a little upset, a little frustrated with the architect firm he was with. Decided to just up and moved his family, wife and a couple kids, to Paris. They were in Paris for about a year, and he studied a lot of French and classical architecture while he was there. Came back to the LA area in 1962. Started his own practice, which became Frank Gehry and Associates in 1967, and finally the Gehry Partners in 2001. So those are some of his jobs. Okay. Here is another one of Frank Gehry's structures. Okay. So some of the principles that he lived by. Actually, I'm going to start here next. So we'll see you here in a few moments.